Hello and welcome to Comic Culture. I'm Terrence Dollard, a professor in the Department of Mass Communication at the University of North Carolina at Pembroke. My guest today is artist and inker Klaus Janson. Klaus, welcome to Comic Culture.
Thanks a lot, Terrence.
You are the man who literally wrote the book on inking for DC Comics, and you've worked with some of the biggest names in the industry over your illustrious career. And I just wanted to talk a little bit about your technique and how you go about putting the ink on the board. Everyone has their own different way of doing it. So I'm wondering, when we look at your work on, let's say, Daredevil with Frank Miller, or your work over, John Buscema, how are you approaching those pencils, and what sort of tools are you using?
I try to approach the pencils with the idea in mind. How can I best help the pencils reach their highest level? And that involves trying to figure out what it is that might be missing, or where someone might need help in anatomy, or spotting blacks, or creating a sense of depth. All those things, plus much more, obviously. Texture, backgrounds, composition, eye flow, all of those things. I try to look at the pencils, study them, and approach it from that point of view. And as far as tools are concerned, I just happen to be sitting next to my desk. This is the brush that I use. I put a little tape on the ferrule to give my hand a bit of a better grip. And in terms of pens, this is the pen that I use. Just a typical pen holder with a 103 Hunt's mapping point pen nib. And I think that's the basic two basic tools that I use to ink on paper. Digital is something else, but I still primarily do most of my work on paper.
When you look at the people that you've worked with, they all have their own different styles, and you are brought in to, I guess, sort of make it even, to bring it out even more. So I'm wondering, when you are looking at the art, you talked about eye flow, and you talked about spotting the blacks. What can you do if you see something that might need a little bit of a push? Maybe it's a younger artist who is still kind of getting their feet wet, versus maybe someone who's an established star. How do you approach maybe making a few changes here or there to the page?
Younger artists generally, when I get an assignment that's done by a younger or beginning artist, usually in their first 2, 3, 4 years of their output, the editor will tell me, help this, push it along a little bit. And so that gives the inker, whether it's myself or anybody else, a little bit more room to play with it and to add a little bit more than maybe on someone like Gene Colan. You don't really need to add anything to Gene Colan, but you do need to interpret Gene Colan. He pencils with the side of the pencil, or he used to pencil. There's a lot of room for interpretation in terms of the grays and the blacks and the white. Someone like, say, Frank Miller, whose pencils I love inking because they are so idiosyncratic. They're very architectural. Frank, I will try to add a little bit of line weight to give it a little bit of a feel of depth and three-dimensionality. The concept behind depth is incredibly important. Not to get too much off on a tangent, but we're working on a two-dimensional piece of paper. So anytime we try to create depth, it's an illusion, it's a trick, it's magic. And the ability to create depth is actually one of the things that is very much lacking in young artists generally, and also in comics generally right now. I think people are so overwhelmed by the options that we have, on the Cintiq or working digitally, that people forget that really there are only three planes, foreground, middle ground, and background. And if we stick to that, that's really the most effective way of creating depth. And again, I'm going off on a tangent, but in terms of pencilers, I really try to, one of the things, my mentor was Dick Giordano. And one of the things that he taught me, or that I learned from watching him, is that he would study the pencils and look at the job at least twice, reading through it and trying to determine what the story is about, what the mood is about, and looking at where the inker can add things to make the pencils work or make the storytelling work better. And I'm very conscientious of that. I really try. And sometimes it doesn't work, Terrence. There are pencilers that I've inked and it just doesn't work for whatever reason. And then also there's a new crop of pencilers in the last couple of years, maybe 10 years or so, maybe 20 years now, that are very precious about their pencils, and they want tracers. And I don't really think I'm a tracer. So that leaves me, out of that category.
You mentioned Dick Giordano, who of course was one of my favorite inkers of all time, and he was someone that you could look at a book and you could say, you know what, I'm going to bet you that's Dick Giordano inking it. And you're also in that category, but your styles are wildly different. So I'm wondering, he mentored a number of famous inkers, yourself, Terry Austin, Bob McLeod, Bob Layton, and the list goes on. And all of you have different styles. So I'm wondering, and I know that you're also teaching as well. So when you are dealing with someone who is a different style than yours and you're trying to help them along, how does that work, that you can help them develop their own voice, so to speak, and at the same time teach them what you know needs to be taught?
Regardless of a person's style, you have to go back to the basics. And the basics are the same for everyone, regardless of their style or the tools that they use. A lot of people are obviously using digital right now, but the basics are the same, whether you're using digital or you're drawing on paper. You have to be clear in your storytelling. Storytelling is about communication. It's about getting your point across. And usually the point, in a very general way, is the plot, the story itself. It can also be emotion. It can be mood. It can be, pieces of information that eventually add up to a larger understanding of the story. But the clarity is paramount. Creating depth is paramount. Being entertaining is critical. Anybody who wants to do this as a career has to understand that there are two components to two requirements to your job. One is to be a good storyteller, and that involves clarity and creating depth and mood and all those things. But you're also an entertainer. Entertainment is part of the job description. So you have to be able to both be judicious and clear in your storytelling, but also entertaining. And entertaining for a penciler might be knowing when to use a big panel. Is the explosion the big panel? Is that entertaining? It's similar to film in that way, although film and comics are not exactly the same. So I think that the basics are the same, regardless of your approach and regardless of where you are in your evolution as an artist, whether you're beginning, you're in the middle, or, you're at the end. You're at the end. There is no end, Terrence. That's the amazing thing about art and about drawing and about inking and about storytelling. There is no end. There shouldn't be an end. If you come to a point where it's over for you, then you have to stop. You have to find something else to do.
You talk about storytelling and having to learn how to present an idea to a reader. A lot of the books that you worked with Frank Miller, he would, I guess there were, from what I understand, there were days when he would give you an issue of full pencils. There might be something where he gives you some breakdowns, and then there might be some issues where you're doing, most of the visual creation on your own. So I'm wondering how that partnership would sort of work and how your skills as a storyteller would kind of come into all three of those areas.
You know, on Daredevil, Frank and I did Daredevil for about 3 years and some change, you know, more or less. I forget exactly if it was 3+ or 3-. And his evolution was at least very consistent in the sense that he started out with very, very, very tight pencils on Daredevil 158. I mean, the joke is that it was really so tight. I could have poured ink on the top of the page and just shuffled it, and it would have, you know, fallen into the grooves. I mean, he was really, really intensely working and penciling on the pages. And what happened is you know, he started doing other work. He started doing other assignments because, of course, you know, people started to recognize what a talent he is. And so we went to breakdowns, and breakdowns are not commonly used as much anymore. But breakdowns generally means, and it was a lot of what John Buscema was doing and Sal Buscema was doing at the time. Breakdowns are just lines with no blacks positioned. And so the inker generally has the power to spot blacks, as the phrase goes. And then toward the last year of our run on Daredevil, Frank, he would draw the pages on typewriter paper, and he would balloon them in dialogue and write the story on typewriter paper. And it was amazing to see, you know, and then I would get 21 pages or 20 pages, whatever it was, of typewriter paper with the comic, with Daredevil, you know, just penciled and written out, you know, and it was perfect. And what I would do at that point in the last year was I would then draw from what he gave me and then ink it and then color it, which was, you know, fairly cray-cray, as the kids say. So at least he was very, very logical in his evolution. And that, as opposed to, say, you know, handing me a really tight pencil job and then a loose one and then tight again, you know. So it allowed me to evolve just as much as it allowed Frank to evolve. And I have to say that he was extremely generous in terms of his trust in me. Also extremely generous in terms of the latitude that he gave me. And I think that was really where I started to grasp and started to begin to understand what storytelling was about. Accepting that responsibility, I learned a lot. You know, you do not evolve unless it's necessary. So, you know, we developed a thumb because it was necessary, you know, for our survival. And animals evolve because it's necessary for their survival. As artists, we do not evolve unless we get out of our comfort zone. And that was a real challenge, you know, working with Frank and trying to become a better artist and rise to his level. And so I really began to understand. I want to emphasize that because there's so much to the jobs that we do that it's really a lifetime of understanding. But I started to begin to understand what storytelling was about, what composition was about, what choices to make that are more effective, less effective than others. And you know, I was very grateful to Frank for allowing me that. And it really elongated or prolonged my career because my job became more interesting. It wasn't just inking, you know, it became larger. The canvas became larger and more varied, and it became just much more interesting.
You talk about evolving as an artist, and I know there are a number of issues of comics that you have done the pencils on as well as the inks. And I've noticed that you tend to get assignments where you are doing a lot of that nighttime, moody atmosphere, whether it's Batman or a Daredevil, or maybe some of those issues of Wolverine in the early part of the run where it's in the Hong Kong city, and it's all done at night. And I'm wondering, your evolution as an artist, you're becoming a better storyteller, you're becoming a better penciler, you're becoming a better inker. Do you find that there's a pushback from an editor who wants you to just go and be that, dark and moody inker?
Yeah, I think that, the one of the fascinating things about perhaps its life, but certainly about the comics industry, is the inability to shake your reputation. Um, so I have a reputation for being, dark and gritty. I have inked well, primarily inked. I've done jobs where I've tried to be as slick as I possibly can, and it does nothing to change that initial impression. That initial impression just stays with you for the rest of your life. So, Paul McCartney's always going to be in the Beatles, right? It doesn't matter what he's done since then. And not that I'm comparing myself to Paul, but in the same way, I can't shake that dark and gritty, reputation. And I've come to terms with it. It is what it is. But I'd like to think that I'm capable of doing a variety of styles or a variety of approaches. I know that I can, and I know that I have. But to add, maybe, Terrence, I've thought recently that some of the dark and gritty and moody and Gotham architecture or New York architecture or nighttime stuff, I wonder sometimes if that isn't a crutch for me. And although I enjoy it immensely, because you get to play with shapes and blacks and it's interesting. One of my favorite locales or locations to draw is the forest or jungle, because there are no straight lines. It's all, you can use any shape and create any line and any composition, because, for instance, if you're doing a story that's in the woods, which I am actually right now, the tree can fall, and you can use it as a horizontal line, or the tree, or rocks, or the ground level can be, is not static, it moves, You have so many more options in terms of composition, or you can be abstract once you get away from the grid of a city or a building or the horizontal and verticals of structures.
It's great because, it's one of those things that, we're all sort of, kind of get stuck in these different boxes, and it's nice to hear how we all want to get out of them, regardless of how successful we might be in there, because, like you say, we are always still evolving. Now, one of the things I did want to bring up that you had mentioned earlier was textures, and that's, as an artist, for me personally, trying to make my art appear three-dimensional, adding those textures. I had How to Draw Comics the Marvel Way, and John Buscema said, oh, you can use a razor blade, and you kind of play around with that. But you've got many different techniques, and I'm wondering how you sort of came up with some of the textures and films that you were using to create different patterns and whatnot, and how you might consider using them to tell a story.
Texture is basically gray. Gray. So a lot of times I used texture to play off a white or black shape, so that there were at least three colors in a panel or on a page. It'd be white, it'd be gray, and it'd be black. Sometimes texture is something that, as you correctly point out, you can use a razor blade and do snow or speed lines or rain. Rain is a good one to use a razor blade. But you have to think of it as bigger than that. I think it's not just the ability to create rain. It is a gray, and if you look at a lot of the Daredevil stuff that Frank and I did, I was using a lot of Zipatone, and the reason why I was doing that, number one, because it looked cool. You have to be an entertainer, so kids loved Zipatone at that point. Now you can do it digitally. Part of the reason why I used Zipatone, in addition to it just looking cool, is that it's black and white. And more often than not, I would ask the colorist, or if I were coloring it, not to color it, just to leave it black and white, so that the figures which were colored would pop against the black and white of the Zipatone. So it's a thought, it's a conscious, deliberate choice to make storytelling perhaps more clear, make the figures pop, give it a little bit of three-dimensionality, in addition to, say, just a texture that may look cool. The ability to create texture is actually a lot of fun. And, I've used terry cloth, I've used, sponges, I've used saran wrap, anything you can possibly think of to create an interesting texture. And most of the time, people, I'm not even sure, are aware of it. But I think it does enter in a sort of a, holistic, subconscious way, because that's the look of your work. And I think it all comes together in the end. We hope.
The look of your work is very recognizable. Like I said before, we can look at a book that you've inked and we can say that that's your hand in that page. And I'm wondering, you talk about experimenting with terry cloth, with a sponge, with saran wrap. Is there just a thought in your mind as you're about to put it on the page, like, this might be a little too much of a risk? I've done 98% of the page, and this might mean I've got to start from scratch at the beginning?
All the time. It's rare. When I'm penciling, it's rare that I don't go through 2 or 3 pages to get to 1 page. It's not uncommon. I can, easily do many revisions. Inking is a little bit, I'm a little bit more, let's say, I don't need to redo a whole page. If the worst happens, if the worst happens, I'll have to redo a panel. And I'm okay with that. I don't mind. The teaching in class or teaching at SVA, one of the things that I notice is the schism or the separation between digital and people who work with paper. One of the things that digital has that paper does not is the undo button. And so if you're working on digital and you don't like what you've done, you just press a button and it goes away. With paper, it's a bigger commitment, and in some ways, I think that the artists who are using digital, because of the undo button, don't really allow themselves to go further into the exploration of possibilities. I know that, I've worked with Bill Sienkiewicz. Bill inked a Daredevil End of Days. He did an amazing job, just incredible. Bill is, as much a genius as we have in this business. But one of the things I noticed about Bill's work is that if he messes up, he doesn't correct it. He just keeps on going. And he'll double down. He'll just keep right on going. And if he and to the point where he might lose the entire face. He doesn't care, because what he's doing is committing to it and playing with it and having fun. And 99.9% of the time, it works. I admire that about Bill a lot. I'm a little bit more, like, oh crap, this didn't work. Let me white it out, or redo the panel. But I like his commitment to it. He's very bold.
Well, I find this is what I tell my students all the time. We learn more from our mistakes than we do from our successes, especially early on in the process. So I can see what Bill's getting at. Hey, this is going to be something I'm going to learn from. I see we have about 2 minutes or so left, and I was hoping that you could speak to someone who might be just getting started. What sort of tools should they invest in, and what can they look for at the art store or online that's going to help them get started in a, either a hobby or a career in cartooning?
First of all, let me just say that it's unavoidable that you're going to have to learn digital. There's no way around it. I know a lot of talented people who, like James Herron was in my class. He did Rumble for Image. He's working on a graphic novel that he's writing and drawing himself now. He's an enormously talented guy. He uses paper, and he's very passionate about paper. He's very passionate about ink. And I applaud that. But in terms of going forward, you're going to have to learn digital. You have to learn the rules. And I'm loath to say rules because it sounds claustrophobic and rather limiting. I prefer to use the word theory and philosophy. There's a philosophy of storytelling. There's a philosophy of art. There's theories about, composition, obviously, how to lay out your page, all of that. So if there was anything that I could say to young artists is, if you have an agenda and your agenda is to tell a story, a specific story, not a specific story with detail and information and characters and plot points, you have to follow those rules, because if you don't, everything else is finger painting. Finger painting does not require any theory or any philosophy. You must learn and immerse yourself in the art of communication, and then take that and apply it to your work. You cannot work in comics, for instance, if you don't understand perspective and depth. You cannot. There's only one person who was able to do that, and that was Charles Schulz. And that was the only one out of everybody. So you cannot, just say, oh, I don't want to learn perspective, or I'm going to use, the digital grid.
Okay, I want to thank you so much for taking time out and talking with us today. I'd like to thank you at home for watching Comic Culture. We will see you again soon. Comic Culture is a production of the Department of Mass Communication at the University of North Carolina at Pembroke.